As the 70s roll in, stability around the world has never been as shaky. Interplanetary alliances join together to seek ideological supremacy across both planets. Cultural shifts are uprooting norms that have been in place for centuries. Technological shifts have been changing how the world itself functions. As these shifts occur, life continues in the Seed-Bearer region, where a seemingly random group of people have come together to try and make sense of the nonsensical. This is Hazeltown Story. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Hazeltown Story. We're not quite starting up the new kind of season / arc yet. So I felt like since we had a good discussion last time that we're going to do another kind of continuing on because we didn't by any chance finish up getting to where current events are taking place in Hazeltown Story with our last episode talking about kind of the history and lore of the world that Hazeltown Story takes place in. So we are continuing on for our discussion with that. And with me, I have today.
Hi, I'm Carnival.
I'm TorpidTypist.
All right. And yeah, we are going to be continuing our discussion on that. Last time where we left off, we kind of got to it was like roughly the the equivalent of the 1850s, although they kind of run on a different epoch that kind of starts in 1700. So it's around 1500 AR there, but in our terms, because history kind of mirrors our world. I think for sake of ease, we're just going to refer to it using our time, so around the 1850s, roughly. So we're going to start there. These discussions are going to be a little bit more freeform because there's a lot to talk about, and I feel like we'll just discuss kind of what we have on our mind. So I feel like that is a little bit more of a conversational style rather than just a bullet point kind of thing. Also can kind of bring out some things that I might have missed or other stuff like that. So starting around 1850, is there any particular point that we want to discuss?
I think we did finish up talking about the Civil War. When you said 1850s, that's like...
Yes. So,
okay.
Right around that time, as we kind of mentioned last time, the Civil War lasted a lot shorter period because the Confederacy basically had a lot more adversaries than it did in our world, because not only did they have to deal with, the actual United States, Seed-Bearer Nation definitely did not want them to basically use that as an opportunity to kind of help sabotage Confederacy efforts. The Locution Empire at that point also had kind of wanted to redo some of the damage that it's kind of undo. Try the kind of because of their negligence during essentially the 1700s, went after a lot of the plantations and all that, doing some sabotage, and by that I mean lighting some plantations on fire. Doing that. That the U.S. Civil War lasted a lot shorter than it did in our world. And I think that was like roughly around the same time. And yeah, that's kind of roughly where we left off. So is there any particular point in either of the two planets that we kind of want to start with?
Torpid, since I got the recap, why don't you go for the first historical point?
I mean, I don't have anything specific in mind, so if you do, I think you could probably start.
All right, since we're, again, late 18, what's happening let's talk about the general climate of Europe in this point, since the Industrial Revolution is about to just start.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So the Industrial Revolution, because in this universe, magic definitely exists. So European general take on magic was the fact that a lot of, with it being primarily Christian based, I feel that, like, especially if you think about like Church of England and the Catholic Church's influence on a lot of Europe at the time, even like the Protestant at that, they generally, at least early on, had a stigma against the use of magic. Not necessarily like, especially like they definitely did not really early on, like let's say around Middle Ages or like I'll say like trying to think like the 1300s. Started out with an incredible like stigma against it. However, as Europe lost a lot of conflicts due to using fight or going against adversaries that particularly used a lot of magic, uh, they kind of lessened their grip on a not using that. So um, they were kind of a little bit at a disadvantage. So you had started to see some use of magic, but at that point, a lot of it was personal use. Like it was like people like using magic, but it was like all people powered. There is a thing also we kind of discussed last time, I believe, like the Kyushin Empire at that point. The thing with that is they had and you started to see it in some of the ones that use magic more often, like the Seed Bearer Nation. One of their major accomplishments that gave them kind of a foothold was ways to store magical powers and repeat magical powers. So Europe had not gotten that yet. However, right around say maybe like 1860s, 1870s, I actually had this written down, but I believe there is an invention that came across that was referred to as the Leyden battery, which is a way to store magical power essentially in a battery form. So what had happened, that is like where you start to see the birth of like technomancy, that point, where you start to have, okay, this device can repeat these magical actions in a chain that cause them to like do mechanical tasks. So you would start to see some contraptions that involve that. I don't think you would have stuff like engines at that point, but you had started to see that start to rise. So you still have like the Industrial Revolution passes as it does for the most part.
So I want to be clarify here. Like you still have combustion engines going on at the
Yes.
same time. It's not just the magic components taking over, correct?
No, that is running in the background, but like combustion would still definitely happen at that point.
I was gonna ask,
And
of the two planets, was there one that like favored technology over the other, or
uh,
developed faster?
so you definitely saw a lot of it on the areas that did magic. So Remus, the place with like Seed Bearer, and the one that's not the one that's not the one that's not analogous to Earth. You definitely saw it. In particular, Seed Bearer definitely got a leg up on technology because they had magic as part of like their culture. So you definitely saw it there. Moon Beacon is an area that you also saw a lot of like technological boom there. Those are kind of the two major technological like giants in that area. And then really in like the Romulus/Earth side, you really saw kind of similar there. Europe, the I don't know, like I'm trying to think of like the arc of the like the British Empire. Like I believe they were still kind of they were growing at that point, or still like I think you mostly saw like the more quote unquote dominant ones. You saw the British, the French. They would probably still be having some of the same skirmishes that they would have. French Revolution definitely still happened. Although I think French Revolution was late. This is part. I'm not a European historian by any means, and so my dates might be off. But I believe French Revolution was it mid or late 1800s?
The question there is which French Revolution?
Uh
Because the first one happened pretty much at most a year after the American Revolution.
Okay. I was thinking like the one that was like right before Napoleon question. I'm trying to avoid saying the phrase "the one that Les Mis is based off of."
Okay.
Because for some reason that's my only time frame. I am starting to realize that I think.
So if we're talking the French Revolution that everyone knows, it began arguably in 1789.
Yes.
Okay.
Which then led to the First French Republic.
Okay.
Which,
yeah,
if you're looking for the Napoleonic years, that would have been. I'm looking right around now.
Because I want to say that was roughly around.
Okay. Oh.
I got it. God. See, this is the problem, is that I have very big gaps in my history, and French history is one of those.
I mean,
wow, I'm shocked. It's almost like it's not relevant to your day to day.
Yeah. So, like, the stuff that happens there is roughly what occurred, because there really isn't a whole lot to say in regards to France. They don't, they don't have nearly as much, because I would say they wouldn't have some of the colonies that they would have had at that point. For example, they did at some point have a little bit in, not Canada, because or the one that's on Remus, which is Nova Britannia. They did have a little bit there, so Quebec still exists. Also, kind of probably didn't have as much as influence on, say, like the Louisiana Territory. There was still a little bit. There is also the French part that I believe at that point they would still have ties to the Prosperity Kingdom on Remus, that they would have old Louisiana at that point. So they did have a few colonies, but not as much of a grip as they had, like, in our timeline.
and I would love to clarify. So Napoleon ran as Emperor of France from May 18th, 1804 to April 6, 1814 for his first reign, and then his second reign was from March 20th, 1815 to June 22nd, 1815.
Okay, that was okay. For some reason, I thought that would occur later on, but regardless, that stuff still happened. France is still kind of doing what France is doing around that time. The major differential at that point would be the Austro-Hungary German side of things. Happens slightly different because there is some difference in the head of the German Empire that does definitely cause some change into the history of that world. In particular, there is a number of people that were very influential in our world that did not, that essentially die in the Hazeltown story.
Oof, ouch.
That basically they are killed for, let's just call it, mysterious reasons. Read assassinated.
Yay.
And one of the key ones in that case is Otto von Bismarck. Basically, for being how expansionist he is, he was like, you know what? He had to go. Particularly the Lacutians did not like him. So he was in a battlefield at some point, and some Lacutians acting as a kind of use that time to basically take him out on the middle of a battlefield, so it wasn't quite as obvious that he was assassinated at that point. But
and they didn't fuck around.
Yeah, no, they definitely don't. Once they realized that, oh, whoops, we accidentally allowed a slavery, they weren't taking precautions this time. And I'm trying to keep on. I really probably should have had this up, but there was a German emperor. I believe it is Frederick the. Actually, I know exactly how I can find it, because it is the father of. It was the person who was the father of Wilhelm II. Whose name was Frederick III. There was a German emperor, Frederick III, that in our world had, I believe it was it was cancer, or like he had a cancerous tumor in his throat, I believe. And he only lasted on the throne like a few months until he succumbed to cancer. Basically, what happened in the Hazeltown universe is that without the influence of Otto von Bismarck and the fact that he was actually able to overcome due to to medical advances that would happen because due to while also locutions were also might have definitely did take out Otto von Bismarck. On the other side, they were also courting them as potential. I forgot exactly what it was, but they essentially got on the goods. The empire itself got on the side of being favorable to the Locution Empire because of Frederick III. The fact that he was a lot more open to, and this is also the fun thing when talking about political system, or in particular political systems, because he was a much more liberal, like director or like emperor. Like he was a lot open to like classical liberalism. So he was essentially taking what is like more known as these. This is all a lot of like, so where I might fumble over some phrasing, but he was, let's just say, a quote unquote more open to, like, he was not as, because the problem is, I'm not going to say fascist because that's not what the actual German Empire was. He was like a lot more open to like, civil rights in terms of like in a comparative sense.
Progressivism.
He was more progressive than Wilhelm II, which is a low bar, but it's still the bar. So he opens up Germany in the Hazeltown story universe. He opens up Germany and it becomes more of a like open the trade and like rights of speech and all that, which German Empire, if I recall correctly, was a lot more strict about that, especially under Wilhelm II. So Germany's heading more towards that kind of like similar to the British in that sense. So that's different in that. And then the German Empire essentially, that's going on there. I would say the Austro-Hungary stuff probably is still going on there. Although, again, this was not a German or European history of the 1800s. It was not exactly my strong suit. So a lot of this is stuff that I have just read over a while. So there's probably areas that I am missing. But essentially, for the most part, other than the German Empire having a different head and going in a different direction than it did, then for the most part, that happens. But likely because of that, some of the alliances might not have occurred that this will get into when we get in later into the 1900s. This essentially prevents World War I from happening.
Which has a whole lot of
connotations that we can get to.
But we're done.
There's other things that would happen that are not quite Verdun. Because don't worry, there's going to be conflicts.
Yeah, I love murder.
Because especially once we get on, not necessarily 1910s in this case, but that doesn't mean that the 20s and 30s and 40s are not filled with fun stuff. So essentially, that's still going on. Like Italy, or what's still happening with whatever Italy was at that point. I don't know. I don't think the Holy Roman Empire was still going on at that point.
Goodness, no. The Holy Roman Empire was... Hold on, let me take a look. But the Holy Roman Empire should have been dead by that point.
I do believe roughly around that time. As part of, because I don't know if we covered it. It's not something that's been a plot point in Hazeltown story, but something also dealing with the Locution Empire that also, if we're talking about German sphere of influence, one of the things that the thing with the Locution people is that a good majority of them need to live by a certain geographical phenomenon. which is basically they can only live next to a energy source. There happens to be one of those in Liège, Belgium. So during part of this kind of like, as part of like some diplomacy things that are happening around this time, eventually around this point, there starts to be a colony, a locution colony in Belgium, which I believe at that point, I don't know if they were I don't think they were independent from Germany at that point. So I don't think they get in until the early 1900s.
I'll double check that next. Also, Holy Roman Empire dissolved August 6, 1806.
Okay, so I wasn't that far off, but yes, no, they whatever's happening in Italy is that, because that's a convoluted thing.
But you're looking for when did Belgium get independence?
Yes, I believe that was 1900, or not, like it was early 1900s, I believe.
I'm looking.
But anyway.
Okay, yeah. Independence was declared from the Netherlands, was declared in October 4th, 1830, with it being recognized in April 19th, 1839.
All right, also the Dutch Empire at that point kind of is the same as what would happen with, actual the Netherlands. So that really doesn't change much in terms of history. I think for the most part, Europe kind of just stays there. I know Ottoman Empire is still going on around that time, so that's pretty much the same. I think that's kind of the major differences in Europe's history at that point.
I didn't realize Belgium was a constitutional monarchy.
Yes. That is, yes. It turns out there's a lot of constitutional monarchies in Europe.
Yep.
I've just, again, my anti-monarchist blood starts rising of just...
There is a lot of, technically there's a king, but also they do jack shit.
King in name only.
Yes.
And money. Lots of money.
Yes.
Which is...
Yeah. So I think that's good for Europe. Of course, I think probably another thing that might be worth talking about, especially if we're talking about Europe and like Earth things that are happening. Asia also definitely a little bit of a.
All right, time for the Century of Humiliation. Let's
go.
God.
So China, for the most part, is the same.
Oh boy.
There is a region. Well, also the thing is so there's some slight country differences in that because dragons exist, or like dragon type people exist on Romulus, which is our Earth. There is one that exists in Asia. I actually haven't fully figured out where. I would say roughly in China, because China's huge. I believe in the north.
Speaking of the Century of Humiliation, I forget, did we mention if the Opium Wars happened or not?
I think the Opium Wars was it? I think we're getting to that.
Oh, we're getting there.
That's
the start of the century.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's why I was asking.
So, especially since Britain doesn't have a whole lot to do, like they would have lost colonies at this point. They would have lost a good number of the colonies, so their interest in Asia definitely would still exist. So I would absolutely say that the Opium War still existed.
Oh boy.
Because I believe China doesn't really deviate like Chinese history doesn't deviate. I can't remember if I wrote down if Mao Zedong also gets offed at some point.
Yeah, that's kind of important, though.
That's a tease.
It is. Important. I do know essentially the long and short is they still become a communist nation. What might change is I believe he does. What happens is someone takes over that essentially still kind of turns China into a communist country. What happens is it doesn't quite do some of the things that Mao Zedong kind of had. It was a little bit more of a kind of gets a foothold or like better handle on the administrative side of things. So you don't have things like the Great Leap Forward doesn't happen. So
or you mean it happens, but instead of the horrible famine, It's
Yes,
actually
it is something. It happens in a way that isn't horribly mismanaged. Is essentially what happens. So
It
yes,
happens, but isn't completely monstrous.
yes. So that is probably the main difference, China, because then everything that happens there.
Well, then what about Taiwan?
So Taiwan, the Chinese civil wars happen. Taiwan still happens, so the Kuomintang are still floating around, or they eventually float around. Actually, I think at this point of Hazeltown story, they still, well, I mean, they're still around today, if I remember correctly. But Chiang Kai-shek, I believe, is still alive in the Hazeltown universe. Or maybe not. Actually, see, it's kind of the things where my mind, because a lot of the times when I'm thinking of the lore of Hazeltown story, I kind of just have a wiki hole kind of thing. And I think Chiang Kai-shek is, I think, one that I just haven't kind of gotten to yet. So his is kind of a question mark, but essentially, for the most part, Chinese history stays roughly the same up until like the 1930s, I think.
Look, that's understandable. History is big, and we can't do everything.
So China's still mostly the same. What does change is Japanese history, because right around that time you have the Bakumatsu period and also the Meiji the Meiji Restoration. So the thing with the Meiji Restoration that's interesting, and this is actually one of the things, because I had it's one of the things that I had a course of it in college, so it's one of the kind of things that I remember. And I remember one of the things was talking about the formation of the Japanese Constitution. There was a debate about when, basically among the people who were crafting the Japanese Constitution, that were basically, do you cover, or do you try and emulate the British Constitution or the German Constitution? And the British Constitution won out. Is roughly a very bare bones, and probably might be overlooking some things. Now, the thing that I had the thought of, because if we're talking about things that the Constitution is based off of, there is now a factor in that did not exist in our world. Because what is occurring, what happened is what happened to what is our United States. Because the thing about that is that essentially what I believe the technical term is, at least I have written down, is what happened to Turtle Island, essentially. What happened to North America. So the primary, essentially the tribes of that, the indigenous people of North America are the ones that are at the head of North America. And it is one of the things, because it turns out there's a lot of Native American indigenous people. I am basing this off of around the 1812, there is the Western Confederacy. And one of the groups in the Western Confederacy was the I believe it's the Haudenosaunee, which are what is commonly referred to as the Iroquois Confederacy, which is probably there's a lot of historical back and forth about they essentially lost a shit ton of the populace in the 1700s.
I love these.
Yes, but in the Hazeltown story universe, that loss didn't happen. So there is a potential that they probably are one of the more dominant indigenous groups. And the thing about the Haudenosaunee that's interesting is that they, in their history, and it's kind of one of the things that they're most known for, is they have if you think about this being given time, they would have grown to probably become, especially now that there is more international dealings, they probably would have formed a quote unquote country, but basically they would have formed a solid or kind of consolidated group. So essentially,
instead of being they became what is known by Eurocentric definitions as a nation state versus
yes,
what they were was a confederation of different tribes and ethnic groups that acted as a democracy.
Yes, a similar kind of essentially, hey, let's kind of make a more like a system where we can interact with each other and kind of, form a nation state. But the thing about the Haudenosaunee is that they are known for something that is called the Great Law of Peace, which is a document that is pretty much, there's good evidence that the United States Constitution is based on this document. So there is a potential that especially if their influence went east or went westward, and if for some reason they, if they had naval and ended up in Japan like we did with Commodore Perry, that their influence might also be in this thing, and that's something I'm not fully. But there might be some slight influence from that in there as well. But essentially, Meiji Restoration goes, they do probably take on more of the British kind of, take on liberalism and, open trade. There is also another thing that happens around this time, which it's a problem of I could never figure out the term for it, but it's essentially. It was also around that time where there was a huge, this was also more in the early 1900s, of Japanese nationalism, like very old school Japanese nationalism.
Okay, good. That was my next question, is that what happened to them?
So my general case is they had some followers, although they did not have nearly the influence that they did.
Because they got beat up or something, or was there just...
Yeah, generally like, hey, it's better, essentially, they lost out. I don't know if it's due to possibly other trade or just other dealings. There also is the thing about Japan that is interesting. I can't remember I think I must have brought that up, but Japan was the first nation to essentially form a teleportation to the other planet on their own. Like, they reverse engineered it. So they are actually the reason why the Lacutians brokered like the dealings with Europe so that they started to come over to the other planet, because they realized, well, we just can't let Japan on its own get there. Like, they had to hey, we need to broker some deals with that so that there is hey, this is happening. And they started to warn some of the other countries that did there. Especially they had essentially where they ended up is they ended up on a series of islands on the, I can't exactly remember what I believe they're referred to as the Sunshine Islands. And essentially they end up colonizing it because there really wasn't a whole lot of population there. So they had a foothold and was starting to branch out over there. There was a slight, and because in order to save a little bit of, especially now that the Meiji Restoration's happening, they decided that it might be better that there's still the emperor, but there is essentially the head of the Romulus side of Japan and the Remus side of their holdings on Remus. Those two have a slight difference on how, essentially the one that was on the Remus side, where Japan saw a lot of expansion possibilities, was a lot. He was not a fan of the Japanese nationalism. He wanted to, let's deal with more. Let's kind of westernize ourselves in order to. This is how this is how we should be as a country or as a nation. And essentially, he mostly won out. So there's still the Japan, it's still festering there. It didn't completely die down, but it's still, for the most part, you don't have nearly the nationalism, at least in the early 1900s. Now, that might occur later on when some other things. But
Yay.
With other things that happen in, say, the 1930s, but it's not founded on it. So that's kind of what mostly happened in Japan. They still have I believe at the time, because if you think about Japanese history and like the Sino-Japanese Wars, especially thinking about World War II, not a whole lot of other countries are really have a reason to be in conflict. Like they're kind of like it's just Japan and China for the well, Japan and China and the places that they're fighting over. Like Britain doesn't really care about that, and if anything, they have more of an alliance to Japan than they did in our world. Like especially also the U.S. has a more of an alliance with them. So that's probably most of the difference there is that they are more allied with other countries, despite United States history of, let's say, racism against Japan.
Yay.
Our
But for the-
pseudo colony.
Yeah, like the fun stuff with Hawaii and the sugar plantations there.
Oh, is Hawaii still independent? That's right. That is a good question.
So Hawaii, well, at that point, they are kind of on their own things because they kind of are like, they're still kind of in a region that they're still more probably under the protectorate of, like, say, the indigenous, Mexico and there, because also, remember at this point, Mexico doesn't have nearly the Spanish influence, because I think we talked about that last time.
Yeah, because they got kicked out.
Yeah, so they probably Hawaii probably is not as touched as much because they might, but that would be I don't think it would be feasible for because they would kind of be on their own if I remember geography wise, because there wouldn't be a lot of other colonies, so it might not be worth it.
Now you mention it, whatever happened? Never mind. We can wait for that.
Yeah.
Speaking of American colonies,
Oh, you mean the Philippines?
the Philippines, yeah.
Philippines would be under Japanese rule.
Oh, God.
No.
Wait, that means the Spanish should get to them first, too?
Oh, right. No, because the Spanish kind of lost their colonial thing after they got the shit kicked out of them by the Aztecs.
Oh, Lord.
Right. Oh, God. Oh, God.
So, yeah, they're under... So, yeah, also Korea is also under the influence of Japan at this point.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
That's
Japanese
not good.
empire. Japanese empire is a little bit, let's say, quote unquote, stronger in this universe.
I'm surprised the Locutians didn't step in.
Well, see, this is again probably part of the things I might need to think about it, but as of right now,
You can take that one back to the drawing board. It's fine.
yeah, because
Yeah.
we have not dealt with that, but I might need to think about that because that also, well, anyway, that might be something I need to go back to the drawing board on, or at least start to think about that. But yeah, at this point, it's like the thing in Clue where you don't have really any things that's like, oh, I guess technically that is true.
That's not good, actually.
Yeah, that's like, oh, no. That's really not good.
Also, another thing that I just had a thought of thinking of colonies, Australia. I think Britain still goes to Australia. Whether or not, actually,
Well, Australia was a prison colony, so...
yeah,
it was a penal colony.
But the thing with that, whether or not the Locutians might have any influence on like whether or not, like I'm thinking of like the Aboriginal, like Australia, whether or not that unfortunately is something I'm not super familiar with the history of that, so that might be but I do believe it's still become a British penal colony and all that. Because it's one of the things where it's like, oh right, it still want to have like some sort of version of like. There's also like another thing, like, because that's also the thing. Cuba was a Spanish colony originally, wasn't it?
Yeah. See, I was going to ask about the status of Cuba and also Puerto Rico.
And Haiti.
Uh,
We already did Haiti last time, I thought. Maybe.
So for the most part, because the British got kicked out of essentially North America, or what essentially was like our North America, I believe the indigenous peoples of those places probably are still there. Like, I don't think they might not have become colonies because they might have gone too, like, logistically, like, oh, we got kicked out of this. If we try and even like the smaller area that's even hard to get to, we might also get kicked out there.
Oh shit! That also means that means the Cuban Missile Crisis never happened either.
There could be other places where that happens.
Yeah, because I was gonna ask, what about the nuclear weapons programs?
I think so how we should probably go a little bit more into, because at that point we're stepping over stuff that happens in the 30s, and like we're starting to miss stuff that happens in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
Where
we can step back. It's just things to think on.
Yeah. So actually at that point, I'm trying to think if there's any other major things that happened in the late 1800s. Major Restoration, I think, was the big one. Some others things. The Russian Empire also at some point colonizes the. Eventually has some form of colony in the on Remus in the Song Plains, which will become relevant in the 1910s. And I think that's kind of mostly there for the 1800s. The German Empire establishes a colony on Remus that is essentially due to their basically holdings of the Prosperity Kingdom on Remus. Some colonies that were some from their area that was under Prosperity's holding get transferred over to essentially Britain, France, Germany, and the Russian Empire also gets a little bit of land in the Song Plains, which is interesting because that is actually a completely different climate. But regardless, they still have some holdings there. So let's go over to the 1900s. Actually, thinking of colonization, the U.S. Because of the geographical difference between the area that the United States is in this world, in Hazeltown story universe versus our universe, there is still expansion to the west. So you still have the Manifest Destiny kind of still happens, although there's a little bit more of a organized conflict at that point, because the Sea Bearer region also kind of has some questions about what exactly it has sovereignty over, because there is a giant mountain chain that is on in the that can separate. Here's where the Sea Bearer region is, and here's where US is. When you start to get towards the middle of the country, it gets a little less because there's more open spot. So essentially, US, you eventually have essentially the Midwest gets. I haven't quite fully figured out what states got taken out, or are not states or more seed bearer territory. In this one, you definitely have states: Texas, Oklahoma, Utah. Utah maybe.
Oh, my favorite character, Utah.
So New Mexico, Arizona, like that area. California, due to the landmass, is not a territory of Sun's Bounty, which is essentially where geographically Mexico would be. They kind of don't have. It's not like there isn't a Baja California doesn't quite fully exist there. So California still definitely becomes a territory. Oregon and Washington are seed bearer territory. In fact, the seed bearers kind of, as the U.S. starts to go west, they kind of try to go west, or the seed bearer tries to make deals with they start to expand west as well, or try to establish that, hey,
these assholes in the South are going to come start trying to come after you.
So they essentially try and race to the west. So what eventually happens is the entire northern part of going from Michigan left on the north part of the country is entirely seed bearer territory. They actually, seed bearer might have conceded a little bit, they might actually have Ontario or some little bits of where Canada, but essentially that's a little bit of that's for another day where I have to think about that. But they go, both the US and seed bearer essentially go west to the end of the country. However, due to some geographical changes, there's a mountain chain that essentially cuts the northern part of California off from the bottom part of Oregon. So there is a little mountain kind of natural divide there. But California definitely still happens. And essentially that's as far as the US kind of goes. It kind of takes that's the
Korea.
territory that it has. Because they don't get Alaska and there isn't like a island chain that's like Hawaii.
Now, what about Guam?
There also probably is not a Guam. If anything, Guam would be in the territory of Sun's Bounty. Because Sun Bounty also understands the bullshit that the US is doing and probably also tries to establish its protectorates of the islands that are by it.
We see you think you're just doing that and we can't see you. We know what you're trying to do.
Yes. So the US kind of runs out of territory. Like it's like, oh, the finalization's there. Okay. So, 1900s. Probably the events to start talking about are probably the 1910s. As mentioned, because of the major thing that would happen around that time, which is World War I, does not happen because as going back to the German Empire, because it starts opening itself, starts to become more liberal. At that point, we have a certain person by the name of Karl Marx gets born, and Marxism spread starts to happen a little bit differently. Doesn't get so essentially as more progressive voices start to get more power in Germany because they're not being repressed. It takes a little while, but Germany doesn't become communist by any means. But think about current Germany is kind of roughly where it, like, due to some differences and not quite sure how to set it up, the German Empire kind of technically crumbles and becomes more of a republic. So it's, it doesn't become an empire as it is. It just becomes kind of more of a state. And due to that and their kind of alliances there, World War I doesn't happen because some of the alliances aren't there. Their political in the 1910s. 1910s, it's different. It'll become more of a story in the 1930s. So, spread of communism happens, or in particular, the first country to have a revolution is Russia. Red October happens. It happens a little bit differently because, again, there are actually there is Russian influence, like there is the Russian colony that is on Remus. Now, the thing with the colony of, so actually talking about some locution things, the colony in the Song Plains that Russia had was particularly not happy with the native. One of the things that the Song Plains, in fact, why it's called the Song Plains, is that there is the religious elements of that country, like their kind of culture is especially around like their religious, like their religion, the culture that comes from that religion. And like music was a huge element of like the culture there. So hence why they kind of became Song Plains. When the Russian colony kind of started to get influence, they started to be repressed. But that still was a Russian colony. The Russian Empire probably still would have collapsed even though World War I didn't happen because if anything, it might have gotten delayed a little bit, but the Russian Empire still crumbles because, SARS were not doing a particularly great job and they were starting to...
Is Rasputin alive? Is Rasputin alive and around as a secret magic ghost thing?
No, this isn't fucking Shadow Hearts.
God. The problem is that
Do you want Shadow Hearts to be real?
Let's put that to the side, because maybe. Because that is a full possibility that Rasputin might have magical powers.
A fucking wizard goes, magical powers and a magical dick.
Except the problem is that it's the world heroes Rasputin and not the Shadow Hearts one.
What matters is, did he exist or not? Because there's a very important song that's very good that came about because of him.
Yeah, but technically that's I think that song comes out in 1980, so that has not come out yet. Anyway, so on the Russia side, the Red October, or like the Russian Revolution, still happens the way it kind of does. During skirmishes, though, it becomes a little different because Lenin is still around. But in the scuffles of the revolution, I'm debating about where maybe during exile he might have gotten sent to the Song Plains.
Yeah, I was gonna ask what's up with the Bolsheviks.
So the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks conflict becomes a little bit different because if you're not familiar with the Bolsheviks and Menshevik, like what their actual meanings were, Bolshevik is just, I believe, Russian for majority. And it comes out of there were a number of color-coded political divides on how their takes of communism. If I remember correctly, I believe the blacks were the Bolsheviks, or I think the blacks were the Mensheviks, which were, if I remember correctly, and I'm probably not 100%, they were more on, if you're thinking about the different sliding scale of social and I probably got the order wrong, social democracy, socialist, communist, that kind of flow. I believe the black were more on the socialist side. They were more of the gradual, they were more gradualist versus the the actual Bolsheviks, which were, I believe, we revolt now. If I probably got some of that backwards, but essentially there was the divide on that. The Romulus and Remus side of Russia differed on which one won. Essentially the Song Plains had more of the Bolsheviks because the Russian Empire used that as their exile point. Like, you're just going on the other planet. You're not dealing with here.
So it's a penal colony.
Kind of. So essentially there is a constant conflict between the two sides where essentially there's both the revolution and it succeeds. There is a union of the two, but due to essentially, let's say differences that might occur in, say, communist ideologies or led things, there are some slight differences on opinion on how things should be run. The Remus side generally is more, I don't want to say tanky because that's not exactly the thing. They're more hardline. They're more of the harder Bolshevik side.
So you're saying they're more directly authoritarian, and in terms of a centralized single authority figure giving top-down commands versus, say, from what we've seen of Seed Bear, is a much more,
yes,
I won't say anarchist, but is a much more horizontal structured, seems to have a much more of a horizontal structure in terms of governmental bodies.
So yeah, the more direct down, that is more the Remus side, where the Romulus side is more horizontal. Like, they're also more, hey, let's start with let's do the motions of let's instill social democracy, which will then install socialism, which then install communism, is essentially their plan. Whereas the Remus side is, no, we're at the end of the chain now. The thing about that is that gets slightly different towards the historical side, because there are more conflicts that happened on the Remus side, and especially if that's where the Bolsheviks is, Stalin ends up dying in a conflict. I don't think he actually got assassinated. I think he just got shot. So that essentially differs in terms of that. So there, whether or not, I am debating about whether or not, because if this is 1970, that would be Khrushchev. No, that would be Khrushchev, wouldn't it? At that point,
I think so. Torpid, do you remember off the top of your head?
Not off the top of my head.
Who is the one that was in Metal Gear Solid 3? I think it was in Khrushchev.
Yes, that would have been Khrushchev, because there was the talk between Kennedy. They're saying, no, there's Jonsson and Kennedy are talking about, we want to avoid another to a missile crisis with I forget this with the virtuous mission incident.
Yeah. So
I hate that we just use Metal Gear for history
It
lesson.
works. It works.
So essentially they might be at that point right now, although so they don't have the Stalinist era. It might go a little bit differently. There is one major conflict in the Song Plains region, though, that is the reason why they are not exactly why you have like the Seed Bearer and Moonbeacon, in particularly in the locutions, don't have a particularly great view of the people, or like the let me actually get the term, or like their actual country name for the Remus side of things is United Remian Socialist Republic. So URSR instead of USSR. URSR. Why they're not exactly the other countries are not a fan of them. Even though they would be, why there is essentially the green faction instead of them kind of allying with the red against Europe, is the Locution Empire in trying to unempire trying to unstabilize some of the colonies, helped with essentially the revolution. One of the things about the revolution, or like their kind of things, was like, hey, the original people of the Song Plains have been repressed for this time. You're going to help them regain their sovereignty to the people, like essentially Lenin and all that. What ended up happening was they tried that, but the original people was like, no, we want our land back, get out. So what ended up happening was that, or at least, hey, here's this area over here, go over there, let us have these lands. But essentially, because they got they were like, hey, no, we're trying to create a global commune, and we're going to start here. Got really, and maybe this actually might have been where Stalin got killed, if he was maybe involved with this. They essentially, the original people got repressed again because they were seen as going against the, like, they were they're actually trying to help out.
And the left eats itself yet again.
What the hell?
Here we go, repressing again.
Hold on, I have something playing sound in the background. I don't know where it came from. Oh shoot, I know what it is. I still have the side tube up.
Oh my god.
It's fine.
I'm leaving that in because I find that funny. But
oh no!
So yes, essentially they get repressed again, and this is an incident that's referred to as the I forgot if it essentially the silence of the Song Plains by Seed Bearer and Moonbeacon. So they're basically equally as unhappy with them as they are with the US and all that, which is the start of the, let's call it, the three factions of what will eventually become the Cold War. They also really pissed off the Locution Empire because they essentially went back on their word. Although whether or not what exactly caused it is, let's just say, up for debate in the world of Hazeltown story. Like, that is a conflict about what actually happened. Your opinion on that usually changes with what allies you are with.
So let's give a refresher just for the audience sake of what the three alliances are, though.
Okay, so essentially, two of them are essentially you have the East and the West of the Cold War, of our Cold War. It's not NATO, because NATO, but that wouldn't make sense. Which are, and usually they're color coded. So let's start with the blue. The blue is essentially the alliance of, on Earth side, UK, France, and Japan. On the Remus side, you have the Prosperity Kingdom and also Japanese influence, or the regions in Remus also support there. Also the US. Also Nova Britannia, or Canada, essentially, also is the alliance. On the red side, you have both Russian colonies. You have China. You have some This has not been a region that has been like brought up a whole lot. There is a region in that's called Life's Canopy that is also allied with the red faction, so to speak, but not that red faction. You also actually on Remus, one of the dragon populated the Castle Rock Republic, which is essentially Iceland. Essentially, so dragons take part, or basically, they're Iceland, or no, Greek. God, I'm getting
Greece?
Leif Erikson. No, it's not Greece. Which is the one that's more rocky? It's Greenland, isn't it? Is the one that's essentially because it's the opposite because green is the one that's like called
cold.
Iceland because yes. So the green, what essentially Greenland is also a member of the red faction.
Ooh.
And then on the green side, you essentially have the ones that are allied with the Locution Nation. So you have essentially North and South America. You have are pretty much entirely allied with green. Seedbearer is definitely one of the major ones. The Moonbeacon is one. The former German colony of Himmelheim is also allied with the green. You also have Germany, essentially. You have the Nordics are essentially also allied with them. India ends up becoming allied with them, and also the Union of African, or like a kind of a think the version of the EU, but for African nations, also becomes allied with the Locutians.
So again, like the actual African Union that exists, but
one with teeth. Yes. So there's a lot of smaller countries that are in the green, but eventually they're all, yeah. So that's the kind of the major alliances in there. So that's what happens so essentially, Russia has its foothold in the Song Plains, which, by the way, to give a geographical location, that's essentially, if you were to map Remus with our world, it's essentially Africa. So, or like African climate. So the complete opposite of modern Russia. So that's also a fun difference. That's kind of the major thing in the 1910s, 1920s.
So does the Great Depression still happen, or has the stock market been, or it's been because we have actual socialist nations, the stock market crash doesn't actually devastate the whole economy?
It doesn't, because Seedbearer definitely doesn't get a thing because a lot of their stuff is self-sufficient. So they do not get affected by the Great Depression. If anything, what affects them is a influx of, basically what happens is there is a, with Seedbearer, basically other countries having problems causes an influx of immigration into theirs, where they start to have the thing of like, oh, we actually have a population that is now starting to become not part of the traditionally indigenous tribes, so we have to figure out what to do with that. So they have problems of like, hey, how do we handle this? Because traditionally it was mostly allied with what tribe you initially were, is where your, like, how its political system works. So you have a bunch of people that aren't allied with, like, don't have like roots there. So it's like, oh, we don't have any provisions to give you any like political power. So that starts to become more problems over, especially during the early 1900s. So like right around the time, like, say, voting rights were happening, like especially with women, is right around the time it's like, oh, how are we going to handle, like, how do we handle your political power, essentially? How do we, like, give you a voice in our system? But essentially, that is also an effect of the Great Depression because of a rise in immigration there. So probably more of the blue ones get hit. So I don't know if... So they probably got... It's one of the things that, again, that's probably a little bit of a weakness in my history. So I definitely know the laws like Seabear definitely does not get hit because they're more self-sufficient. Now, if we're talking more uh, more political fun stuff, the 1930s definitely is probably one of the more tumultuous kind of political decades because
Time to bash fascists.
the rise of fascism. Well, not maybe not the rise of fascism. Well, the starting of the influence of fascism. Uh, Italy is a giant question mark on where I want that to be.
Yeah, that was my big question because, like, go ahead, Torpid. I've talked more.
Oh no. I was gonna say, what was it the Spanish Civil War? What goes on with
Oh,
that?
oh God, you're right. The entire Spanish Civil War.
That was a big old test bed for World War II weapons.
Spanish Civil War probably still happened. If anything, like their changing of empire might have actually caused that to happen at a different time. Is again, my Spanish history is nil, so that is a question mark for another day.
Okay, because yeah, I was gonna say because that's also one of the big, like, we saw a bunch of like anarchist and communist communes develop in the same areas as long with battling out fascists in during Spain during that entire civil conflict.
Yeah, so what likely happened with them is, again, it might have to do with how I handle Italy because the fascists definitely partially take power. What I'm thinking right now is that they take power in Italy, but uh, what also happens around that time is Germany. Going back to Germany, uh, the Spartacus movement in Germany, which was a large pushing of, you know, the Spartacus group is essentially let's make Germany communist. Whether or not they definitely have more of an influence than it did in the actual, Spartacus movement. Because also the thing with that is also, um, well, here's also the question: what happened to Adolf Hitler? Because he essentially had no real influence because World War One didn't happen, so he never really was a. He might have. What might have happened was.
Did he become a middling painter?
I'm thinking that's probably what happened. Is that he was probably a. He probably was served in the military. He might have had some conflict with people there, but he did not. The Nazi Party did not gain as much power as it obviously did.
I forget, was it him who survived a mustard gas exposure during World War One?
Yes. Well, I think wasn't that like the part of the reason why is like claimed that he might have had some like association issues with that, or like that fueled some of his like delusions.
I don't know. There's so much written about Hitler that's like,
Yeah, but essentially, Hitler did not become power. Um, I would imagine that the Nazi Party probably existed, but it did not become a major powerhouse due to the general progressive nature of like as the German Empire declined, it generally became more progressive. Probably, definitely, a social democracy.
so did we hit full Weimar Republic levels or not that levels of just
Probably not that level. What does happen is, in a technological sense, a lot of the stuff that the Nazis burned, in particular the sex, like a lot of the sex clinics in that, survived. They survived. So, what actually happens is, especially due to the influence of, you have a lot more indigenous influence. So a lot of non-European cultural influence. You have a massive boost, especially with when you have advances in animancy. In particular, Germany and its former like colonies actually become a large hub of medical things and full sex transition can happen in the Hazeltown universe because of that.
Okay.
There might have been a character that you came across that actually had that happen, but
Look, man, I'm just saying that's one of the great things about Magic settings is it's a lot less of a pain in the ass.
yeah. So, actually, rights for like gay and like general like lesbian, gay, and all that. Generally, rights have been better in Germany than they had been. So you actually get advances there that transition to most of the, let's say, green territories. Probably still not as great in the blue territories and probably better in the red territories, although historically, those two areas have not been great. But yeah, at least see progress there as a result of the fact that Germany becomes more, whether or not where it falls like aligns in term like where exactly it falls, it definitely becomes more of a more allied to the idea of whether or not it actually is it's not an actual, like, I would say it wouldn't even be a socialist nation, but it becomes more accepting of it, and they start to have more of a, like, they have seats in parliament. Like, the Social Democratic Union, which is an actual German party, becomes more powerful. Even though they're not the Communist Party by any means, but they start becoming more of a voice for progressive issues. So Germany, and probably will extend even to the Nordics as well. So they actually, what I think might happen is they might see Italy as a threat. So there might be a German-Italian war. That could be happen. Also, while we're talking fascist, going over the UK. So because one thing that happens is because World War II doesn't happen, and this is something that affects affects a lot of, or a few countries. Because the Nazi Party, you never saw the horrors that the Nazi Party did. That has
smaller parties start showing up in other countries.
Yes. So you have rises in fascism that, like, they start to actually, they haven't had the thing where they haven't shown their full ass yet. Like, the Holocaust doesn't happen, which is overall a good thing. Let me say that fully before I say the next sentence. Because the Holocaust doesn't happen, a lot of people's vision of what these people can actually do doesn't happen. So they actually are able to gain a little bit of a foothold in, like, seeing a little bit of legitimacy. In particular, the UK definitely has it. I don't know the history of fascism in France, so that's could potentially be a thing. This is also where you might see it in Japan. Because they saw it in rise in the US and the UK. So that is kind of also happening in the background. One thing that, and I'll mention this mainly because, I mean, Hazeltown's story takes place in the Sea Bear region. During the 30s and 40s, trying to think of how to phrase this. The general, not feel of the country, but the general stance of the country as an empire, because at that point, it technically, it is an empire by any means, because the original, like, tribes that made up the Seed Bearer Council, it definitely, they kind of, overtook some of the tribes that, like, were in the region. They kind of, like, grew as an empire. It had a self-reflection at that point, because also the Sea Bearer, like, kind of ethos was very open on some things, very strict on the other. In particular, it is very protective of, like, it's I'm trying to think how to phrase this. Seed Bearer did not. Let me phrase it like this, because this is actually important with actually some people's background, or actually some characters' background. It was also around this time where the Sea Bear had a self-reflection about how it runs the army of its country, because it had a standing army at this point. But it was always like very. They realized they didn't really need like their how they handled like it now that especially now that technology is starting to increase and just like inner like communications exist. They changed or like they had a self-reflection on how it handles like its like the actual mechanisms of how the country works. Because a lot of it was kind of, especially when it comes to more of the outer branch at this point, kind of becomes like more decentralized. So what essentially happens at this point is you actually have a little bit of social uprising because or a drive for unification because sometime like this is around the time where you saw what happens like I'm just trying to think of how to phrase this. This is where Seedberries drops its national army. But because also all this stuff is happening, they realize that really they don't need an army to go and fight on behalf because what I'm thinking is they might have joined a few other countries in some wars. And generally that didn't work out that well. That they realized we don't need an army. If anything, we don't need an outstanding army. We need a self-defense force, essentially. They essentially, well, it's kind of a comparison. They essentially, Japan after World War II themselves. Like they realized, you know what, we're actually we are not because what probably likely happened is some like, you know, standard corruption and just general mismanagement. They realized this is actually a bad idea for us to have this. If anything, we need a self-defense force. Also, around the same time, we never really had any sort of mechanism for how policing works there. And what people are starting to realize is their police force that they had really sucked. So what they did, this is around the time where they had a reflection of like, okay, here's the things that we need. We need, the thing is like, we would be fine if an army, except for the fact we are sandwiched between two countries that we are not, like, we technically aren't at war with, but we might as well be at war with. They could strike at any point, because US is below you, Canada's above, and though Canada's probably not going to do much. But Japan's also right over there, too. So,
I was about to say, like, oh man, take down a standing army when you're right next to the United States of America. With nice land. No.
So, this is where the home guard system happens. And they realize that, you know what? They actually start to do, like, the things that, you know, they start to research how they handle their police cause. Because they had a few incidences of, basically, the force was, like, acting, well, let's be honest, they're acting like police forces. They got to the point where they were seen as like bullies and all that. Like they had gotten to the point where they had set them like the Seedbearer thing had a mythology of the fact that like guardianship is a massive part of Seedbearer culture and like, oh, the police are the guardians of the people, so to speak, and which let them get away with a lot of bullshit. So due to unrest in the 30s and 40s in the Seedbearer region, this is where the DPass and all that kind of system goes on, where they start to go away from a traditional policing system to having their, you know what, instead of having like police people like patrol around, we're going to have people who are mostly medics and guides and people who are not like armed for the most part. However, because we need a standing army, we're also going to integrate it in with this system as well. So we are having a standing army that is like patrolling, but these people are mostly medics for the most part. And like fire people or firemen, they are more of, they're doing the thing like a lot of people now, or like some communities now are doing, where they have more of a check-in person. rather than sending in a police person. So you still have a organization for like investigation, but if there's someone who is going to intervene with some sort of conflict, like that just kind of brews up, it's not going to be someone who is like mostly trained with a gun. They're mostly going to be trained with ways to de-escalate.
So so that means most DPAS agents that we would see on a day-to-day basis are not carrying any sort of firearm. They might have like a nightstick, something like that.
They might not even. They probably won't even have that for the most part.
But they all are technically trained in firearms in case of hey, United States is doing a thing.
Only partially. So that's where the home guard system is.
I was gonna say, I figured it depend what arm you're part of.
Yeah. So I was thinking about like I believe the ratio that I'm thinking of is it is about a 25% of DPAS units are part of the home guard, and they're the ones who mostly, if they would carry a weapon. For example, Toby is an example of someone who is part of the home guard. He specifically carries, like especially when he is dealing with a national park, he carries a revolver. So he carries a weapon that is made that essentially is like, hey, I'm likely going to deal with if I need it. That means shit's gone terribly wrong, and I need to take down an animal. Like I need something with like a hunting weapon. I do not need like a military weapon. So most of them, like some of them, like especially if they're in like the populated city, might carry a military weapon, but usually in a way that is not like they are not carrying it. It is on their person, and yeah, they're trained with it, but that is not their primary goal. Like if they're thinking of like the thing that like you would have on your hips are more likely a med pack than a handgun.
Okay.
Now, that's not to say that there aren't like investigation. Like there is it's something that you haven't run into, although you might run into in the next arc. Is that I think it's the Department of Criminal Investigation, so the DCI as compared to the Department of Public Assistance and Safety, those are the people who are like investigate, like they are detectives. Those mostly people aren't also armed either. So that is, they kind of go under that change, and there's actually older members, like older citizens of the Seed Bearer. Actually, you're more likely to come across where they have a suspicion of like these people because they remember the old ways. So it might have some hangups about that. So that is actually a part of Seed Bearer's lore, which I figured I mentioned that because this takes like, I mean, Hazeltown's story takes place in Seed Bearer, so I figured that's probably worth mentioning. But other than that, they really don't have a. The other thing that happens is they have much more of a centralization of like. This is where you see like they realize that the Seed Bearer, like the council that essentially acts as the guardian of like. There's a mythology of like the thing about Seed Bearer is in their like they never understood, like they did not have any sort of concept of ownership until they essentially met other cultures. Like ownership is not part of their thing. Like they realize it's like, why you can't own anything. The world, like you, when you die, you don't take it with you. The earth owns it. Like this land, like you can get like taken away from it at any point. The earth owns it. We don't own it, which basically translates into like we're just taking care of stuff, and we want to make sure that we're doing like the best we can. So what eventually happened at that point, you had the system of like they took care of. They basically organized that they contain the kind of the council, which is just the general term of the general government. Took control of essentially anything that is essential to life. So housing, food, like any of like the major needs, they essentially took control of it. So that's probably what what happened in Seed Bearer. There is basically a solidification of their political system at that point.
Okay.
That's probably a lot, but I figured like that might be worthwhile mentioning because that's where Seabear takes place. U.S. at that point. Let's see, Great Depression.
What happens to the mob, considering places like Chicago and stuff are firmly seed bearer territory?
So they can they have ways of getting in there. Like there are definitely mafia in Seed Bear. They're just a little bit
Quieter.
more. They're quieter. They definitely more exist and like are not as blatant as say they were. They probably still exist in like places like New York, like in the U.S. side. They definitely still exist. I'm just trying to think about things and like, the U.S. actually helps out with some of the campaigns that occur within. They actually ally themselves with, at least on the Remus side, with some of the Japanese things that are happening. So going back to the time that Hazeltown story actually takes place in, the Vietnam War. Obviously, that like it's not Vietnam, but they are helping out with the major conflicts that are occurring in the Heaven's Hearth area, particularly the one of the because the Heaven's Hearth region is broken up into 3 countries. You have Marsnord, which is basically it was part of it had German influence, but it kind of broke apart and kind of became independent. That is actually a side that's more allied with on the red side. You have Mane Solus, which is more Japan has influence there. So they're allied with the blue, and you have Valley Bianca, which is traditionally green, but that is also where you have a proxy war between. Basically, actually, all 3 factions are having a sort of a proxy war because you have the red and blue side want influence there, like they want to like control that region, and then you have it's kind of think about like in the situation of Iran, where it kind of became this secular kind of. It was formerly very much a theocracy, but it kind of became more secular at that point. The other major faction in the conflict there is basically let's revert back to our old roots.
Okay, so we have a reactionary militarist group is trying to fight off a secular government that may or may not necessarily have.
Essentially, the reactionary faction is basically saying that the secular government has failed because it is currently unable to control, like basically has lost favor or like, well, it's basically become
heaven.
Not quite, because they are also like due to influence from or having problems fighting off influence from in terms of like it's government is being very much filled up with people who are either hard allied with or are more allied with either essentially the blue or the red factions. So its government is starting to like collapse in on itself. So yeah, essentially that is what's happening there. That is also the region in particular that Rhapsody and Lomi come from, just as a FYI. So there are some people that have fled that region.
Right. That's you are South China Sea, so
yes. Also one yeah. So that's what's going on there. Kind of lost my train of thought. I think I might have rambled on a little bit. Just trying to think. Is there any other like things that might be worth pointing out in that time frame?
Robert, do you have any? I can't think of anything.
Which once again, which year is this? Or what year?
These are like, think of let's go between 1920 to about really at this point, modern.
So 1920 to 1970. Oh, right.
Cover the nuclear weapons program.
Yeah,
Yeah. So nuclear weapons eventually did get developed, although they occurred at a much slower pace because there wasn't really a need for it. Or like World War II didn't happen, so you didn't have the drive for it. They definitely exist. It is mostly in control with the U.S. definitely has it. Obviously, the Russians definitely have it. I'm thinking maybe a few other countries have it, and then basically on the Earth side, the same countries that would have it now or at that point have it then.
And
So
no one has used them at this point, correct?
So what I'm thinking there might be a case where like they obviously got tested, but I don't think there has been nuclear conflict at this point.
Right. I was just making sure that we haven't done. There hasn't been we're gonna just drop the bomb on Hiroshima or Nagasaki
So,
to make a point.
no, Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not happen, or anything of the equivalent that has not happened yet.
Okay.
So no, that has not happened yet. I know one of the things that we originally talked about was we were talking about the troubles that occurred in Ireland.
Hey.
One thing that's probably an easy, quick one. Has anyone been to the moon yet?
So at this point, probably not because if anything, you have interplanetary travel at this point. So they're probably still working on it, and it's more of a case of like the desire to do so probably waned a little bit. So they probably are getting close to doing it if they haven't already. So if anything, it might have gotten delayed a few years.
Okay, but they have definitely sent up shuttles into space and.
So you probably had some initial like space programs at this point. I just don't know if we have like anyone has landed on the moon yet.
Okay, that was just something I thought of, like a more fun one before we dive back into.
So I know the troubles had basically because that is entirely or that is a UK Ireland thing. That just happens because there's no reason for it not to. They're still next to each other. Again, talking about characters, this is probably also why Lila got out of Ireland. Just looking at some of the other notes that I had.
So Lila is directly from Northern Ireland, then?
She's not from Northern Ireland. She is Irish.
I just was wondering when you specifically said, because while the Troubles were bad, they were specifically localized mostly within Northern Ireland. So
she might have lived. She initially was from. She is from Dublin, but she might have gotten something in Ireland or in like Belfast or something like that, like as a postgraduate kind of thing. And it was like, you know what, screw this. I am forging my own path. I'm just going outside. I'm leaving the planet.
Okay.
Fuck this, I'm going to space.
Other than that, I think that covers most of the notes that we had here.
Iran Contra happened yet?
That was mostly the 80s, wasn't it?
Right. Reagan was president then. He's not president.
Yeah. No, he's governor of California at this point. Oh,
Tragedy.
Also, one thing actually, because I think maybe we should probably like just trying to think of, because one thing that came up, Henry Kissinger. So he originally was in like actual like he came from Germany over here during World War II and fled Nazi Germany there. What I'm thinking happened there because it's like, oh, like World War II didn't happen, so he had no reason to immigrate to the U.S. Well, what I'm thinking happened there is that his family ended up moving over, trying to find new land in Himmelheim when that inevitably transferred away from German rule. There probably might have been some unrest, especially if it started to become more like during the issues of like maybe might become a communist nation, that his family fled to the US then. So he still is in the US now in this universe.
Horrifying.
Trying to think of any other like small things, but I think we've actually covered up most of the things that we had on this list. Did anyone have any other quick?
I try to think of something quick because like shoot. Trying to think. Oh, Woodstock.
Woodstock would have happened. Like in terms of like, because also it's the thing of like there's a weird mismatch of like technology and culturally right now it is 1970. Musical styles at that point is the music of 1970, with maybe some slight changes or advancement because of technological advances in, like, say, synthesizers and all that. So you might see some more influence of, like, the technological, like the you might see some, like, early electronic, especially, like, thinking of the stuff of, like, Yellow Magic Orchestra or, like, Kraftwerk might have been done a little bit earlier. Well, I think Kraftwerk actually is contemporary with this time.
Yeah, I think Kraftwerk is contemporary with the 70s.
Yeah, they would have just started at this point. So you might have seen more of their like later stuff. Just trying to think. Hmm.
Oh, that does remind me. Who's Pope right now?
Probably.
Because then that makes me think of, did the Council of Vatican II happen, or are they still doing Latin masses?
Yes. So anything with the Catholic Church probably is still happening, as has it. I don't think that would have gotten interrupted at all.
Okay.
No, yeah, I think the Catholic Church wouldn't have, like, had any of its stuff derailed. That does bring the question. The only thing, if Utah is U.S. territory, then I think Mormonism probably would have happened at the same thing.
What a tragedy.
Although his thoughts on, like Native American, like, influence on things,
that's
probably got him, like, it is probably a thing that exists in the U.S. Probably would have been straight out outlawed in the Sea Bear region, or, like, he would have gotten thrown out.
Because Utah is still part of the United States. Because that like, basically I see it as, if Utah did make it, because no, wait, Missouri is part of the Sea Bear Nation.
Okay, let me actually bring up a U.S. map.
Because, like, did we say last time that basically the area of the Louisiana Purchase is about kind of the Sea Bear region?
A majority of the Sea Bear, a majority of it is, but say places like Louisiana, I think I essentially cut it off that, like, Oklahoma and Arkansas and, like, Tennessee, like, that vertical line.
Didn't the U.S. basically do the long Korea method?
Yes.
So yeah, they.
What I'm gonna fucking call it, and nobody can stop me.
Okay, so if I'm looking at the U.S. map, what likely are the states of the U.S. are, let's see, California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. Probably maybe Colorado got cut into.
Okay.
And then Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri. I would say Missouri's probably in the Sea Bear area.
Okay, now the Mormons.
Anything north of those, including the states I just mentioned, are Sea Bear territory.
Okay, because
So imagine that there was a much more prevalent mountain range, like probably the Appalachians are pretty big, but more like dense mountain range between, like, Oklahoma and, like, probably going down the line of like around the Ohio, Indiana, like, so that Kentucky's probably on the right side, and thus US side.
Because man, that means the Mormons don't. If they do exist, they don't exist how we know them at all.
Okay, that's a sacrifice I'm willing to take.
What a tragedy! What a tragedy! Oh, the Mormons! Who?
Yeah. So, yeah. So yeah, that's kind of roughly that's kind of what at least I got, at least from the written stuff. So last call on any other.
Look, we'll have to do the postscript episode of which we talk about the century of this humiliation.
Yeah, probably yes. I'm sure after maybe this next arc we'll actually come up with some stuff. So, which should be the next time you hear us in Hazeltown Storyland. We should be starting not only the next arc but also the next series. Because we are now no longer in the land of Hazeltown Story Discovery. We are now in the land of Hazeltown Story Contact. So
Hazeltown Story Murder.
Well, we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, it's gonna happen eventually.
Yeah. So with that, thank you all for listening.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Hazeltown Story. If you would like to get updates on this show and many other shows hosted by me, LoloDePuzlo, you can follow at Hazeltown Story on Twitter. And if you would like to get to know me more from a personal standpoint, you can follow my personal Twitter at LoloDePuzlo. If you would like to watch this be recorded live, you can go to twitch.tv/LoloDePuzlo and follow the channel for notifications of when this show, as well as other shows like Retro Rank Rhapsody, are being recorded. If you would like to add this podcast to your podcatcher of choice, you can search for WLDP Hazeltown Radio and find us on most major podcatching search engines. Or you can manually add rss.hazeltown.life to your podcatcher. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come around for the next episode.